Steve Moran here. I am at the Direct Supply Technology and Innovation Center. We're actually not really exactly doing technology and innovation right now. We're going to talk politics and political action. I am talking to Brian Perry. You are completely focused on senior living advocacy. Let's just talk a little bit about your passion, your background, how you got here.
Sure. No, it's funny enough, been doing it for like 20 years and still doing it on purpose. Most people don't want to hang out with politicians on purpose, and for some reason I've chosen that path. I studied public policy in college. And so it's always been a little bit in the DNA. Ended up working a year at the Indiana State House for a senator who was deemed kind of a bulldog, a budget guy in charge of Medicaid rates, Medicare rates. And the Indiana Healthcare Association saw this and thought, well, if he can handle that bulldog, we'll hire this guy and he'll get whatever we want. And they learned very quickly that was a bad decision because the guy's a bulldog. They hired me to run reimbursement, and I did not know the difference between Medicare and Medicaid, and that's a fact. But we learned quickly and we figured it out, and then went provider to provider. I ended up running government affairs at HCR Manor Care after Cliff Porter moved on to the American Healthcare Association. So I've spent a career trying to fill his size 27 shoes, and was at HCR Manor Care, which became ProMedica, for almost a decade, and then have been here at Direct Supply for about 3.5 years doing the government affairs advocacy bit.
So what are the big issues right now?
The big issues right now are roughly the big issues 20 years ago when we started, right? For in the advocacy space, it's almost always going to be payment politics, right? Regulation, payment, certainly on the skilled nursing side, we're always going to be, not always, hopefully, but we have certainly been for 20 years now in an under-reimbursed and over-regulated space. We just dealt with July the 4th, a $1 trillion Medicaid cut, right? And sure, nursing homes got an exemption from provider tax cuts and whatnot, but let's be honest, governors and state legislatures are going to have $1 trillion less to spend on Medicaid. We're going to have some issues for our providers in our 50 states. We're in a regulatory environment where regulations do seem to be easing a little bit, which is exactly kind of what you think under a Republican rule, right? Like under Republicans, you're going to have a harder fight for dollars. You got to do better with regulations. Democrats win, it's going to be the flip of that. So there's always going to be issues. Always defense to play, but always offense.
So as you look at when I look at senior living and the regulatory environment, I guess it's probably true about everything. You've got sort of the three segments. You've got nursing home, you've got assisted living, and then you've got kind of everything else, the non-regulatory side. And how do you break down the differences in those three segments?
Well, it's interesting you call it the non-regulatory side, because in a lot of ways, I think that it's helpful for us as advocates and lobbyists to think about it as maybe pre-regulatory side, because you see the regulatory creep that happens. And I think that happens for lots of reasons. I'll be blunt about it. Lawyers need somebody to sue. Advocates need somebody to yell at. And I feel like they've wrung every, drop of water out of the turnip on nursing homes, right? And so they're saying, well, where should we go next? And it's maybe not a coincidence that, toward the end of the Biden administration, we started to see some regulatory pressures ramping up on assisted living. Now, where does that go? I don't know. It depends on election cycles. But then to your point, you've got sort of that third bucket, which is everything else. But the way that we at Direct Supply sort of look at it is sort of caring for seniors wherever they are. So that could be in the hospital, and that could be in the home, and certainly everything in between with the post-acute settings. So we want to be a very strong and loud advocacy voice for seniors wherever they are. And that really helps sort of provide a guiding star for us. And so whether that be the nursing homes or the assisted living facilities, we feel like the issues really are one and the same. Too often, those segments have thought that they were in competition with each other. And instead, we always say they agree on 85% of the things. We should be screaming loudly together about 85% of the things. And I feel like it's the same way in hospitals and in the home care settings. And I feel like this one voice advocacy concept that we've really been starting to yell about gets some traction. And I think that's how we prevent things like $1 trillion Medicaid cuts from happening next time.
So there's so much negativity that goes on with the whole aging services, and there's cynicism. And frankly, there are some bad operators out there. How do we address that particular issue?
I would say there are bad podcast hosts out there. There are bad politicians out there. There are bad head football coaches of college football programs out there. There are going to be bad apples in every sector in which you go. I think that the important thing is to focus on what's really happening with the masses. Can we put a system in place that roots out those folks? I feel like there are lots of regulatory hammers that can be swung appropriately. There are plenty of paperwork provisions and transparency provisions that we currently have in place that can help identify some of those actors. But I think for the vast majority of things that are happening, for every bad headline you see in the Washington Post that says this awful thing happened in Galena, Illinois, or wherever it may be, there are 50,000 stories happening every single day that we need to put some info on. They're not sexy. They don't draw as many clicks. They don't draw as much, furor from news reporters and advocates and lawyers, but I think it's our duty as advocates in the space to tell those good stories.
I absolutely agree with that. I think storytelling is such a powerful thing, and it's something we're not very good at. I know we're going to have another discussion about that later today. When I look at senior living, as you mentioned, there has been some talk about regulating assisted living. And some talk about more reimbursement for assisted living. As I step back and do a big picture examination, it seems like there are a fair number of people that are in skilled nursing today that are only there because they don't have any money and could be actually better served at a lower cost in assisted living. But the flip side of that is that could also invite more regulation. Do you see any hope for creating a more integrated system that saves money and works for everybody?
I think that you have to think about what the capacity looks like, certainly when you overlay the demographics of the aging population with the infrastructure that we currently have today. There's not enough rooms for people, be they SNF, AL, or combined. I think that states in particular start to see those that are using Medicaid waivers for assisted living. If they start realizing that resident A could be there at this cost as opposed to going to a more expensive setting, I think there's room for all of it, because the numbers alone, the sheer numbers of elderly Americans that we're going to need to take care of over the next 20 years, that alone means there is plenty for every. There's not a tug of war on occupancy, maybe like there was 20 years ago, like we used to see. Getting policymakers there is a very, very difficult thing to do proactively. So often, too many people only make decisions about fire protection when the house is on fire.
Yep.
Right. And until that house is on fire, I kind of feel like till you can start to smell sparks, though. Am I wrong about that? They need to get really smart about this. I think perhaps what happens is when governors start having to look really deeply and really sophisticated at the idea of providing Medicaid services with $1 trillion less over the next 10 years, they're going to have to put pen to paper and figure this out.
Do you see the hope for revamping, maybe starting over on the skilled nursing regulatory side? As I look at it right now, it seems like what we've done is we've created a system that's actually added a lot of expense and arguably not increased quality very much.
Is there an opportunity to start over with that? I certainly think that those conversations have to happen. They have to be led by clinical leadership. You're going to get a chance, I think, to talk to Liz Jensen. She's one of the best in the business. Having voices like Liz's around the table who have truly the senior in mind. Too often, I think, in the advocacy space, you will find people that are out there with alternative priorities to advance their organization, to advance their own agendas, and having a clinical mind at a table with the senior in mind. Anything that is good for a senior is going to be good for providers. Anything that is good for providers is going to be good for the entire system as a whole. It just seems like that should be the guiding star for everybody. Is there a way to go back and start to blow things up? I would have told you maybe 12 months ago. Actually, exactly 12 months ago, I would have probably been more optimistic than I am now, as we were talking about Department of Government efficiency, and those efforts have sort of waned a little bit. They've taken all the comments. I'm optimistic that we will see some rationality in the regulatory system that has to make it easier. I don't know how we care for all of these people with the workforce crunch that we're in right now if we don't find ways to make things more efficient.
Yep.
And yes, robotics and some of the innovations and things that you're going to see here this week will help with that. But that's not how we get all the way there. We've got to find ways to provide more efficient care, or we're just not going to have enough human beings to do it.
Right. So, talk to me a little bit about why Direct Supply is so passionate in putting resources into advocacy. I think that as I look at the industry, as operators look at the industry, it's like, well, that's the association's job. Why are you doing this?
If you rewind, what's it been? BBA 98 really is where the regulatory system started to go ramp up off the rails, and frankly, where just reimbursing the cost of care really started to fall off the cliff. And our CEO Bob Hillis realized back then, when we were primarily serving nursing homes, that if 100% of their regulations were coming from the government and 75 or 80% of the reimbursements were coming from the government, we better be where the government is too, helping out our customers. Every minute that one of our customers and their caregivers are spending in front of a piece of paper that the government is mandating of them, or trying to figure out how to squeeze $100 out of care with $80 of reimbursement, that's a minute that they're not holding the hand of a patient, right? And they're not improving the life of a senior. And we realized that if we can get in there and do that sort of, call it dirty work, but pound the halls of Congress and build those relationships in the states to make those systems better, both regulatorily and from a reimbursement setting, this can be better for our customers. And what's better for our customers is better for the senior. So again, it's that senior in mind, very mission focused. And so us being able to be out there and doing that work is a huge advantage for our customers as they're trying to figure out how to take care of America's seniors.
So, are you effective? What wins the be?
I mean, what ones have we had? Certainly, so much in the space. You're saying, what successful defensive plays have we made? Right, things could have been worse. That's always the way things are framed.
Right.
Just this week, the governor of North Carolina backed away from a $330 million Medicaid cut in the state. Coincidentally, that cut was announced right after Congress and the president signed a bill cutting $1 trillion from Medicaid. Now, we're told those weren't related, but okay. Um, we have a digital ad campaign that we put out through our 501c4 advocacy group called Direct Supply Senior Living Advocacy that was blanketing the state of North Carolina from July on. And we feel like that absolutely helped make a difference. We were educating voters, educating policymakers in that state. We're doing the same thing right now in Idaho. We've not fixed that issue yet, but there's a 4% cut happening in Idaho if the governor doesn't change his mind there. And we're realizing when we can take our message and meet it in front of policymakers where they get their information, which anymore, it's on a device, right? That they have their eyes in front of their device as much as my 11-year-old. We think that that is absolutely changing the narrative. We know that we can not just get our message about smarter policy in front of policymakers, but we know that that's not enough. It's changing the minds of voters because voters are the currency that these folks pay attention to. And so taking the message to the patients families, to the caregivers and the caregivers' families, that alone is an army big enough that we should never hear the word no again. We're not there yet. But we think that linking arms with associations and being an additive voice to that and their voices being additive to ours is really how we get that done.
Yeah, so I'm actually like to dig a little deeper into the intersection between the trade associations and what Direct Supply is doing.
Sure.
How does that work? How does it become an army rather than a conflict?
There's no conflict because the message is the same. We're out there. We're not competition. We're not funded by members. We're doing innovation work, AI work, selling products and services. They're growing membership through dues-based services and their state affiliates and whatnot. But the mission's the same. We're out there fighting on behalf of America's seniors and making it better for the provider caregivers in the country to build that infrastructure. We work with our capital partners. We don't see words like real estate investment trusts and private equity as bad words. We see them as access to capital to build the infrastructure we're going to need. Direct Supply also, I think, can serve a really unique role with trade associations in that we work with all of them, from the hospitals to the home health, but in particular those post-acute settings. So if professionally, you would say that our best friends are at Argentum just as much as our best friends are at ACA, and where we can get them talking together again about the 85% of things that we all agree on. That's a nice unifying voice that I think we can all do. So often their members are members of multiple associations. When I was at HCR Manor Care, we were members of both Argentum and ACA and Cal. And ways in which we can drive those voices together, I think, is to the betterment of the American senior.
So my sense is that there are a small number of operators who are really deeply committed to advocacy, and that there's a much bigger group that are looking at it, and either they're cynically saying it doesn't matter, or I don't have the time or resources. Uh, would it be better if there were more people, and how should people get involved, and how should people, particularly those who are not doing it, how should they be thinking about this?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about, let's make up a mom and pop in southeastern Indiana that maybe has one assisted living facility in their community versus a Brookdale, right? Certainly, you're not going to expect, the amount of political capital that mom and pop is going to put up is going to compete with Brookdale. But there are ways in which those voices can be outsized. That mom and pop in that small community in Indiana, their executive director is probably on the Rotary board, or they are their son is in Cub Scouts with Congressman Smith's son. And those local relationships. Yeah, it's overplayed. We've been saying it for decades, but all politics is local. So there are varying voices and varying degrees at which everything is needed. That mom and pop voice in a rural community can talk about rural issues in a way that, a corporate headquarters based in Toledo, Ohio cannot. A not-for-profit facility can talk about politics in certain political offices on Capitol Hill that a for-profit cannot. When I was at HCR Manor Care, we became ProMedica. We moved from for-profit to not-for-profit. And certain Democratic doors on Capitol Hill suddenly flung open to us that were just barred shut before. And we were providing the same type of care with the same human beings to the same human beings. But that status totally changed how it could be advocated. You've got to have that whole group on the same bus driving in the same direction. And so the more voices, absolutely the better. To the cynical ones that you ask about who say it doesn't matter, I would say, take a look at your rates and tell me the politics doesn't matter. Take a look at the reams of reimbursements that you abide by and tell me that doesn't matter. Lean in, pick up the phone, visit us in Washington, D.C. a couple times a year, and let's get together and have these conversations and then tell us it doesn't matter.
Okay, so let's dig into that. I have once or twice participated in one of these fly-ins where they go visit senators and congressmen, sometimes state level, sometimes national level. Does that make any difference, or is it just all performance?
Politics is certainly a lot of performance. I would say that some of the louder politicians that you'll probably see this Sunday on news shows are performance artists to a T. And I say that as a former theater guy myself. But there is value in showing, right? Half of business success is just simply showing up in those things. Take another healthcare sector. When you see the white coats walking around Capitol Hill and going door to door, everyone in Washington, D.C. realizes, oh, the docs are here. What are the docs issues, right? You have to do that. There are minimum standards. It used to be that we would always say, and you'll still hear this from associations, we've got to have facility tours. You've got to bring your congressman through your facility. And that used to be the thing you had to do. I would tell you that's the minimum standard. That's where you have to start these days. You must start there. But yeah, no, when you march around Capitol Hill, there's almost always a bubbling topic. Very rarely in the last 20 years can I think of a congressional fly-in that we had for any of the associations where there wasn't some burning issue that we all needed to be in there talking. When they hear it in mass, but they see it from their constituents, that's the difference. I'm a lobbyist and I'm a suit. And I walk into a congressman's office from California and I may have the right message, but there's still that thing in the back of his head where he's like, this dude can't vote for me, right? Yeah. But when I bring 7 people from his district who can, that conversation becomes very different.
So I find myself wondering if there's a huge opportunity that is being missed to include employees and family members in this process.
That's exactly what we're talking about when we talk about building this army of folks. Because if you just take, an average facility that has, say, 100 SNF beds, think about a very smart guy told me one time that their guesstimate is they've got each resident has 2.7 family members who deeply care about the care being provided there. One has to imagine that applies to every caregiver as well, because that's their job. And in some cases, that's the sole job in their household, right? And so when you start building all those together, how can the care that's provided in that facility not matter? Think of every vendor that walks into that facility, whether they're selling meds or floor mats or robotics. Every one of those people have something too. That's why our 501c4 is funded exclusively by vendors. We realized that those suppliers need to have some skin in the game as well in the advocacy space. And that's been hugely successful for us. So as we build that army, and again, Steve, we're not there yet, but talking to folks like you and talking to campers like this, I'm realizing we need to build that army, folks. And that's exactly what we're planning to do.
Yeah, I just think about that. And I think we've got a community with 100 residents. There's probably 600, 700, 800 people that you could get even half of those people fired up about sending a message to their state lawmakers, the federal lawmakers. It can make a big difference. And just going to your team members and saying, you guys want free money, you want to be paid better, you want to have a better environment. This is the way you can get involved so you can be paid what you're worth.